Conference. I want to welcome you to our third out of a series of 6 Lunch and Learns, which is a part of the Lay Leadership Equipping and Developing Initiative. Today we'll be talking about the practice and what it means to listen well and what it means to practice our listening skills. We strongly believe that if we are listening well to one another, it will help us lead well. And whether or not you think your listening skills are strong already, we can always use improvement. And we feel that listening well can be a learned skill and an improved skill. So that's why we're here today. So I want you to remember that all of the teaching segments of these Lunch and Learns are housed on the Central Conference YouTube channel. If you have not seen the first 2, we highly encourage you to check them out and to encourage other leaders in your church to check them out as well. Teaching for us once again today is Dr. Juan Kim. Juan is the pastor of discipleship at New Community Brownsville and also an adjunct professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. He holds a doctorate in organizational leadership and has expertise in the area of emotional intelligence. He is a husband, a dad, he loves the Lord, and he loves the Lord's church. So before I hand things over to him today, I invite you just to pray with me before we begin. Let's pray. Holy God, we just praise you for this time and this place and this virtual space. I thank you for those who are listening with us live, and I thank you for those leaders who will be listening and learning from the recorded session, Lord. God, we know that you have put us together for a reason to lead your church, Lord, that you do not have us do it alone. So Lord, teach us what it means to listen well to one another. Teach us what it means to see and hear you through each other. And lead us, Lord, today. So we lift this time up to you. We pray that it glorifies your name and that it furthers your kingdom here on earth, Lord. We pray these things in your precious and in your holy name. Amen. Take it away, Juan.
All right. Thanks, Jill. So thanks once again for joining. Some of you look familiar, so I'm glad you didn't get scared off from the last couple of sessions here. So today is going to be a little bit different, as Jill mentioned. It's going to be much more practical. So some pieces will be recorded, but a lot of this is going to be us working in groups of 3 to practice active listening. So I hope you're kind of ready for that and kind of mentally prepare yourselves to be doing more of the talking today. So let me quickly share my screen as there's a little bit of content I want to make sure we're on the same page about before we break out into our small groups. Hopefully you can see a big sort of title slide. Are we seeing that okay? Yes, no, hopefully, okay.
Yeah.
No, assume we're good. Okay. All right. So as Jill mentioned, listening is really important right now. And I would say, within the conditions we're living in right now, being separated from people, having to communicate via Zoom and other methods like this, it's so much easier to feel disconnected. And I would say it's all the more important to make sure we're listening well to each other. And keying in on things that we normally would maybe pick up subconsciously in sort of actually being in front of each other. But because we're distanced in this way, I think it's even more important to pay attention, to be mindful, particularly as leaders in the church, as lay leaders, as ministry staff, whatever our roles are. It's really important for us to be particularly present to the people that we're relating with, even if we can't see them face to face. And so I'm hoping that this will really equip you well to do that, to pay attention to the folks around you, to your families. It's funny, right? We're spending, especially if you have family at home and you're kind of stuck together for long periods of time, it can feel like you're spending all this time together, but how much of it's really quality time? How much of it is intentional time where you're actually communicating and listening to each other versus just sort of passing doing your different activities, whether it's kids in school virtually or work and juggling so many different things. So I'm hoping that this will kind of help you, give you some tools to pay attention to those around you and give you a structure for how to listen well. Again, for the benefit of those who are watching later on, we're not recording the small group sessions for privacy purposes, but I'm hoping in this sort of content, this teaching piece, it'll give you enough structure, enough guidance to be able to practice this on your own. It's done in groups of 3, and it's pretty simple in its structure, though not, of course, easy to do because listening well is not easy. But I think you'll have enough to go off of to practice this. And also for those of you joining us, use this structure afterwards to practice this with those, particularly that you trust and would be kind of along with you on the ride for this. All right, so I'm going to give you homework right off the bat here. What I need you to do is I'm going to give you about 20, 25 seconds to think about this, is to come up with a specific personal or ministry related issue that you're struggling with, and one that you're willing to share in a small group with 2 other people. I would advise not picking one that has a ton of back history that's going to take a long time to explain. You're going to have about 5 minutes to explain what's going on. So if it's something that's going to take a lot longer than that to unspool, you might want to think of something else. But try to come up with something that, again, you're willing to share, that you're okay having other people know about. But that will hopefully be helpful for you to kind of talk out with somebody who's going to be listening. So I'm going to give you about 20 seconds to think about that right now. And then you'll have a little bit of time before we break into groups again as well. So I'm going to give you that 20 seconds right now. All right, 20 seconds feels like a really long time on Zoom, I'll say, when you're just sort of sitting in silence. But hopefully you came up with something in that time. If not, that's okay. I'm going to be talking for a little bit longer, so you can kind of keep simmering on that. If you did come up with one, again, you're going to be talking about this in small groups in just a short while. But hopefully even just bringing that issue up will kind of help it sort of marinate in the back of your mind, so you'll be able to talk about it fairly clearly as we go into our practice. All right, so what is active listening? If you were on our session last time, the slide should look very familiar to you. It's basically the same thing, but it just will be a helpful refresher on what active listening is and how we can practice it and kind of think about it in terms of a mental framework. So the framework I find helpful is to stop, to look, and to listen, as you kind of see in the arrows down here. Stopping really is the important part. We can't listen well if we're not 100% attentive to the person who's talking. If we're looking at our phone, if we're distracted by something else going on. If we don't stop, it's going to be really hard to really actively listen. That would be passive listening, right? Or not listening at all. So stopping is really important. Looking, so maintaining eye contact, making sure that the person sees that you're with them. That's also super important. You want to make sure that you're cueing to that person, that you're signaling to that person, hey, I'm listening to you, I'm with you, I'm not paying attention to anything else going on. And then, of course, listening, which you do by paying attention. The goal of active listening is to seek understanding. It's not to inquire. It's not to get your own story across, right? The purpose is to understand what's going on with that person and what they're trying to communicate to you, the emotions behind it, the facts, of course, but your focus again is on understanding where they're coming from and not about your own spin on it. So it's going to be very tempting to ask inquiring questions or leading questions, but when you're in active listening mode, you can't do that. You have to kind of shut that part off. It doesn't mean you're not curious. It doesn't mean that you don't have questions, but we need to make sure we're understanding before we start launching into questions like that, because we need to build trust with that person. Before they may be willing to even answer some of those leading questions. Or we don't want to, if somebody's coming to you just as a sounding board and you start giving them advice back, that's really offensive. We don't want to do that, especially as leaders, as shepherds of God's people. We have to be very careful of not imprinting our biases or our preferences upon people who are coming to us. Understanding, accepting is much more important, particularly off the bat. This also means never interrupting. A metaphor that might be helpful or a visual that might be helpful is that you're keeping the spotlight on the speaker. You're always making sure that the spotlight's never shifting off of the person who's talking. So if you do speak, it's going to be very quick, right? So the language you can use, what I found to be helpful is using an opening format, something like, it sounds like, blah, 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 or it seems like, sort of a soft entry, right? You're sort of testing the waters. An example of this could be, it sounds like being with your kids all morning made you anxious and you were really worried about missing this training this morning. And if you say something like that versus saying, boy, you're coming off really anxious, or wow, that sounds terrible, you're giving an entry to that person to respond to you, right? You're reflecting back what you're hearing. You heard maybe there's some anxiety there, maybe some worry about being late, some anxiety maybe just from being with the kids. The person can then say, yeah, you're right. I was feeling pretty anxious about that. I hadn't thought about it that way. That's helpful. It gives me sort of language to understand what I was feeling. Or they may say, oh, anxious is kind of a strong word. I was kind of actually more annoyed with having to be stuck with my kids because my husband said he would spend time with them and then stuff got thrown off, right? And then they can kind of take what you said and kind of go from there. So the spotlight's staying on the speaker, right? It's their story. They're going to continue their train of thought. You're just kind of helping guide it and make sure you're checking in and understanding what it is that they're saying so that you're on the same page with them. That kind of check-in can also indicate to someone, oh yeah, you are actually paying attention to what I'm saying. You're using some of the words that I used. You're reflecting back some of the emotion I was expressing that I may not even have been aware that I was expressing. And so that's kind of the idea with active and reflective listening is you're really only kind of speaking to what was said versus sort of speculating or leading into the next point. Or worse, it's starting to tell your own story. Like everyone, I feel like all of us know sort of one-uppers, right? Person who always has to tell that better story. We don't want to do that in this case. Okay, so that's kind of the thought behind it. Again, if this is a helpful metaphor for you, spotlight the speaker. So if you find yourself, oh, I'm talking too much, almost sort of visualize yourself sort of literally putting the spotlight back on the person who's talking. Okay. All right, that's really it as far as the teaching goes. We're going to do a couple of things before we jump into our groups. I'm going to explain kind of how our rotation is going to work. And then Jill and I are actually going to demo this, hopefully well. I'll be the listener and Jill will be the speaker. But I'm going to try to demonstrate this for you a little bit. But I think it might be helpful to first understand what's being asked of you, and then you'll kind of see us model it, and then you'll go off on your own and do this in your small groups. So you're going to be in groups of 3, and there's going to be 10-minute rotation. So everyone gets to play each role one time, and so one full sort of turn will be 10 minutes. Okay, so there's a speaker, so the person who's telling the issue, talking about the issue that hopefully you've thought of, and that speaker will be speaking for 5 minutes with minimal interruptions. And then there's an observer who will be watching, particularly the listener while the speaker is speaking. So the listener is kind of taking notes on the listener's body language, what kind of active listening they were doing, were they talking too much, that type of thing. You give a little bit of feedback after each round. Now let's just bear in mind with this feedback that none of us is perfect at this. We're all growing, and particularly because I'm assuming you don't really know each other as we practice this, it's a little bit contrived. Plus we're on Zoom. There's a lot kind of working against us with this, right? So let's give each other grace, but also honest feedback, because that's what's going to help us grow as listeners. So let's be gracious with each other during the feedback in particular. And then lastly, there's a debrief. And what I'm going to ask to do with the debrief as you begin the debrief part, so I'm going to ask that the listener start the debrief by quickly praying for the speaker. So just a quick prayer over whatever whatever comes to mind based on what you heard, right, and how you listened. And then you'll debrief for 3 minutes together. Now, of course, the really kind of the most important role here is the listening role. You're going to be practicing active listening. You can try to use affirming body language. And what I mean by that is, don't sort of go like this and kind of appear standoffish. Try to lean in maybe a little bit. Do what feels natural, right? Don't sort of force these things. But certainly maintaining eye contact is important, or staying at the camera, I guess, in this case. But just trying to kind of be mindful of what your body language is communicating. And then in terms of when you're speaking, you should only really be speaking when there's sort of natural breaks and when the speaker is saying. So it can be, when they're taking a breath, drink of water, whatever the case may be, sort of natural rhythms in a conversation. Or maybe right at the end, maybe it's such a pressing thing, they're just going on for 5 minutes, and that's okay too. The key is to not stop the person, right? You want to look for those sort of natural breaks. It's a lot harder than it seems like, and you're probably going to notice that in a moment. So that's kind of your directive. And then you'll do that 2 more times, right? So we'll be in these groups for a little over 30 minutes. I know that's a lot. I actually created a PDF of this slide that is in the chat now, but I'll go ahead and put it in the chat again, just so it's at the very bottom. And this is actually something you can download if you want. And if you want to practice this, offline, feel free to do so. But you'll have this as a reference point if you look at that PDF. I didn't want to screen share during your breakout rooms because I don't want all the room taken up by the screen. I want you to be able to see each other. But before we go into the demo, are there any questions about what you will be doing? Basically, what's on this slide here. Does that make sense? Any confusing points? Okay. Well, it looks like we've lost a few people. So I think we're down. I was like sort of purposely not looking. So now it looks like we've got one group. So hopefully the 3 of you can stick around. I don't know if everyone can be on camera or not for this, but it's sort of important that you can be and able to speak. So if you're not in sort of a loud area, if you are, let us know if you can possibly move somewhere quieter, if that's your situation. But that's kind of the plan. Does this make sense to the 3 remaining folks? Okay, you're gonna get a lot of attention from us during this. Okay. All right. Well, yeah. And again, if you're not able to be in a quieter spot, I don't know what's going on. A couple people aren't on webcam, so hopefully you're with us and can participate fully. If not, let us know, and certainly Jill, Patty, or I can sort of step in and make sure that there's 3 people in the group. Okay, well, I think, Jill, we're up as far as demoing. Now, we did talk about a prompt, which I've now forgotten, but hopefully you remember what your prompt was.
Do you want me just to start in?
Yeah, okay, so what we're gonna try to do is, I'm trying to make you bigger on my screen. I'm having a really hard time doing that for some reason. Oh, you know why? Because I need to stop sharing my screen. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. Okay, so yeah, so Jill's gonna talk for just a few, it won't be full 5 minutes, I don't think, just a few minutes about a prompt we sort of talked about in advance. And I'm gonna try to demonstrate what active listening looks like, hopefully well to model for you as you go into your own practice. So the spotlight is yours, Jill.
Okay. Hi, Juan. Hey, Juan, I just wanted to talk to you about something. Do you have a minute?
Sure, of course.
Yeah, so I had kind of a rough morning this morning. I had a staff meeting, and so I'm in my office with the door shut and, having a really great staff meeting virtually. But then I kept hearing somebody knocking at my door, and I tried to ignore it because I didn't really want to interrupt the staff meeting and have to go get my door. But then my dog starts barking because he hears the person knocking. And I was so torn, because I'm not really used to navigating that. Zoom is still kind of new to me. And what is appropriate as far as interruptions? Should I go get it? Should I not? Mm-hmm. It was really frustrating, and I just needed somebody to kind of hear that and listen to my frustration.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, it certainly sounds like you were a little bit annoyed, maybe a little frazzled at having to deal with all these interruptions during your call.
Yeah, it was. I was frustrated.
Yeah.
You heard right.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so unless you have more to say, I think we could probably end it there. Okay, so a couple of things I want to point out with that. It feels super awkward, right, when you're doing it. Because, and I'll say this as a listener, I've having kind of been in this role many times. This is a bit contrived, right? Because you're kind of telling me a discrete story. But often in these situations, the temptation as the listener is to like want to tease more out, right? To like, okay, well then what happened next? But if it's sort of like in this case where it's like, oh yeah, that sounds right, and that's sort of it. It was just a matter of her wanting to tell someone that she was frustrated. That's fine, right? That we shouldn't necessarily expect more. But the temptation can be very strong to be like, to start asking questions like, oh, what were you talking about in the staff meeting? And to just start asking questions that weren't necessarily put on the table by the speaker. And that's not always inappropriate, but it's not maybe, and let's assume, let's say that in this case, Jill was super frustrated by it for whatever reason. If she wanted to kind of stay on that and I started asking these other questions, that could feel dismissive, right, to her feelings in that moment. So there is a strong temptation, I think, at least I feel it, to want to tell me more, but it's really on the speaker to drive that part of it, or to not, or to choose to not do that. So yeah, I know that was kind of silly, and it's so weird to do this on Zoom, I have to admit, having kind of, this is the first time we're doing it this way, but hopefully that was helpful. Any kind of questions around what we were doing, or kind of like my posture or what I said, in terms of being an active listener, before we jump into the small group?
I did feel heard. I will say that.
Oh, good. Oh, good. All right. And that's the goal, right? That's the goal. Good. Okay. Well, it looks like we've lost one more person. So Patty, do you want to be in the group? Because I know you mentioned wanting to practice yourself. So if you want to be the third in this group, that would make it work. Okay. You are muted, but I'm going to assume you said yes.
I can be part of that group.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I mean, at this point, you have the link. So if you need a reference, kind of how the time's gonna be spent, you can take a look there. We do have, I think we're right on time here. So hopefully you each will get a chance to play each role. And you know what, if it's okay with you all, I'll jump into your room and just kind of observe. And this way I'll be there if you have any questions about procedure or anything like that, if that's okay with you all.
And Jill, will you be staying in the main room?
Yeah, I can stay in the main room, and I think I'm gonna actually print out the PDF while I'm in the main room.
Okay. All right then. Should I send everybody to the room?
Yeah, let's go.
All right, let's do that.